It was a quiet afternoon when Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General, took the podium for a press conference that would shake the foundations of the legal world. With her signature confidence and commanding presence, she stepped up to the microphone, adjusting her suit and pausing for a moment to let the room settle. The media packed the room, eager to hear what she had to say, but no one expected the bombshell that was about to drop. Bondi's voice was steady, but the words she spoke immediately silenced the room. I am here today to expose the actions of Judge Boasberg, a man who has been entrusted with upholding justice. What I'm about to reveal is the result of a months-long investigation into his conduct, and the truth is something no one in the legal community can ignore. She began, her words sharp, clear, and deliberate. The cameras clicked, and reporters leaned forward in their seats. Bondi's reputation as a no-nonsense legal figure had always commanded respect, but today, she was making it clear that she was about to take down one of the most trusted figures in the judiciary. For too long, Judge Boasberg has operated under the radar, using his position to manipulate cases, misuse his authority, and make decisions based on personal interests rather than the law, she continued. The room buzzed with disbelief. This wasn't just a political move. Bondi had done her homework. She wasn't speaking off the cuff. She was about to take down someone with immense power, and she had the evidence to back it up. Today, we reveal that Judge Boasberg has been involved in secretive, unethical activities, Bondi said, her voice unwavering. This isn't just about one bad decision. This is about a pattern of behavior that undermines the integrity of our entire judicial system. And now we must hold him accountable. The room was electric with anticipation, as reporters frantically scribbled notes. Bondi had just named her target, and the political and legal world would never be the same again. Judge Thomas F. Boasberg had long been considered a respected figure in the American legal system. Appointed to the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, he had earned a reputation as a calm, impartial judge, known for handling high-profile cases with apparent fairness and a deep respect for the rule of law. His career had been marked by landmark rulings in both civil and criminal cases, and many saw him as someone above reproach, an example of judicial integrity. But as Pam Bondi's revelation echoed through the press conference, the facade of his respected reputation began to crack. Bondi didn't just name Boasberg. She revealed a pattern of misconduct that extended back several years. According to the investigation, Boasberg had used his position to quietly influence case outcomes, favoring specific parties with whom he had personal or financial ties. Bondi mentioned that there were dozens of cases where Boasberg's rulings were allegedly tainted by outside influence, and documents from confidential meetings had shown that he was actively involved in unethical discussions with lawyers and lobbyists seeking favorable outcomes for their clients. The revelation hit harder when Bondi laid out the secrecy surrounding Boasberg's judicial decision-making. According to the leaked court records and testimony from former associates of Boasberg, there were closed-door meetings where decisions were made without any legal justification, often influenced by personal relationships or monetary incentives. The case details were damning, with Boasberg allegedly using his authority to steer cases in favor of political allies and wealthy donors. Many in the room exchanged nervous glances as Bondi provided more details. Her statement wasn't just a call for accountability. It was a declaration that the judicial system could no longer afford to turn a blind eye to these covert actions. Bondi had laid the foundation for the ultimate fall of Boasberg, and the public now demanded answers. As the news spread, legal professionals, political commentators, and ordinary citizens alike began to question how a man of such influence could have evaded scrutiny for so long. Boasberg's long-standing public image as a reliable and fair judge began to unravel. His judicial decisions, once praised, were now under intense scrutiny as the nation grappled with the implications of Bondi's revelations. The stakes were high. Would Boasberg's secretive behavior be enough to undermine his entire career? Would the legal system be able to recover from this scandal? Bondi's bold move had ignited a firestorm of debate across the country. In the weeks following her explosive press conference, Pam Bondi faced an onslaught of questions about why she chose to expose Judge Boasberg, a figure many had revered for his career and public service. Was it personal? Was it a political move? Or was it something more significant? Bondi, in her usual direct manner, made it clear that her actions were driven by a sense of duty and a commitment to justice rather than any personal vendetta. During an interview, she explained her motivation. "Let me make one thing clear," Bondi said, her voice calm but resolute. "This isn't about a grudge. It's about accountability. For years, I've seen how the system can be manipulated by those in power. Judge Boasberg wasn't just abusing his position, he was undermining the very principles that are meant to guide our judicial system: fairness, integrity, and public trust. Bondi went on to describe how she had first encountered irregularities involving Boasberg through whistleblowers, lawyers, and former judicial staff who were deeply concerned about his behavior behind closed doors. These witnesses had seen enough to raise alarms, but fear of retribution had kept them silent until now. I've been involved in public service long enough to know when something is wrong. These people came to me, terrified that if they spoke out, their careers would be over, Bondi continued. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let someone like Boasberg continue to operate with impunity, knowing that the integrity of our courts was at stake. This isn't about politics, it's about principle. It's about standing up for what's right. Her words were punctuated with a sense of urgency. She wasn't just fighting for justice in a single case, but for the very credibility of the judicial system. Bondi's stance seemed to resonate with many, and as the story gained traction, more whistleblowers came forward, adding weight to her accusations. As public support for her grew, it was clear that Bondi had done more than just expose a corrupt judge. She had sparked a larger conversation about judicial transparency and accountability. She had set a precedent. No one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. The public, many of whom had previously seen Bondi as a political figure, now saw her as someone willing to fight the system, no matter the cost. As the story of Judge Boasberg's alleged misconduct continued to unfold, Pam Bondi's presentation of evidence became the cornerstone of the case against him. During another high-profile press conference, she took a bold step forward, unveiling shocking, irrefutable proof of Boasberg's secretive actions. In a quiet, controlled manner, Bondi displayed leaked court documents, emails, and testimonies from former associates, all of which painted a disturbing picture of the judge's behavior behind closed doors. The documents included confidential court rulings that had been altered without any clear legal justification, alongside records of suspicious phone calls and meetings that suggested Boasberg had been negotiating decisions with influential lawyers before the cases even went to trial. It's not just the rulings that are the problem, Bondi explained, holding up one of the leaked documents for the cameras. These documents show that Boasberg was using his position for personal gain. He was involved in off-the-record negotiations, using his judicial authority to benefit select parties in exchange for undisclosed favors. The documents, which had initially been kept under wraps, were now in the hands of the public, and they were devastating. One particularly explosive piece of evidence revealed that Boasberg had been colluding with a prominent law firm, directing favorable rulings for their clients in exchange for financial contributions to his personal charity. The charity, a front for funneling money, had been linked to political donors, further suggesting a network of corruption that reached beyond just the courtroom. Bondi also presented the testimony of former staff members who had witnessed Boasberg's unethical behavior firsthand. They described private meetings where Boasberg would shut out opposing counsel and make unilateral decisions based on personal relationships rather than legal reasoning. These whistleblowers spoke of an atmosphere in Boasberg's chambers where influence and power were wielded behind the scenes in ways that directly affected the outcome of cases. With this mounting evidence, it became impossible to deny the extent of Boasberg's actions. The once untouchable judge, who had long been viewed as a pillar of integrity, was now facing a scandal of unprecedented proportions. The legal community was reeling, and the calls for Boasberg's resignation or impeachment grew louder with each passing day. Bondi's careful presentation of the evidence turned the tide, making it clear that Boasberg's actions were not just isolated incidents. They were part of a long-standing pattern of corruption that had gone unnoticed for far too long. The fight for justice was no longer just about the judge. It was about restoring the trust that had been shattered within the judicial system itself. As the weight of the shocking evidence presented by Pam Bondi began to sink in, Judge Boasberg's response was swift and defiant. On the steps of a federal courthouse, Boasberg faced the cameras for the first time since the allegations had been made public. His expression was steely, and his voice unwavering as he addressed the accusations. "I stand by my record and the integrity of my work as a judge," Boasberg said, his tone filled with indignation. "These allegations are completely unfounded and part of a calculated political attack. I've always made my decisions based on the law and the facts presented in front of me. These documents that Pam Bondi has so dramatically shown are nothing but misleading distortions." His defense painted the entire situation as a politically motivated smear campaign. Boasberg accused Bondi of targeting him simply because of his involvement in sensitive cases that went against certain political interests. He claimed that the leaked documents were misinterpreted and that the testimonies were misleading at best, orchestrated by people with a vested interest in tarnishing his reputation. Boasberg's argument was built on the premise that the investigation against him was biased and aimed at discrediting his rulings on major cases. I have been fair and neutral throughout my career. I've handled cases involving highly sensitive matters, and I've never let personal interests cloud my judgment. The truth will come out, and I will be vindicated, he declared, attempting to regain control of the narrative. His supporters, many of whom were prominent legal figures, rallied behind him, echoing his sentiments about political attacks on his career. They dismissed the evidence Bondi had presented as circumstantial and unsubstantiated. But despite his firm defense, the cracks in his argument were evident. The mounting evidence, including financial ties and the testimonies of whistleblowers, made it difficult to dismiss the allegations as mere political theater. Boasberg's denial only fueled the growing public distrust of his position. His once unshakable authority now seemed vulnerable, and the pressure was building. It was clear that the legal community was divided. Some believed in his innocence, while others started to question the ethics of his tenure. As Boasberg stood firm in his defense, it became evident that the fight over his future was far from over. The public, however, had already begun to make its judgment, and Pam Bondi's exposé had already set the wheels of justice in motion. As Pam Bondi's allegations against Judge Boasberg continued to circulate, the public's response grew louder and more polarized. Initially, many legal professionals and political insiders were hesitant to take a side, unsure of the full extent of the evidence or the motivations behind Bondi's claims. However, as more details came to light, support for Bondi's stance began to swell. On social media, hashtags like #JusticeForTheCourt and #BoasbergExposed began trending, and citizens from all walks of life rallied behind Bondi. Legal experts, including prominent attorneys, former judges, and law professors, began to publicly support her, praising her for bringing transparency to a broken system. One prominent law professor wrote in an open letter, "The integrity of the judiciary is the cornerstone of our democracy. If these allegations prove true, Judge Boasberg's actions have endangered that trust, and we must stand with those who seek accountability like Pam Bondi." The media quickly caught on to the story, and coverage spread rapidly across both traditional outlets and online platforms. Major news outlets like the New York Times and CNN ran in-depth investigations into the leaked documents, while legal commentators took to television to dissect the validity of the evidence. The growing public sentiment was undeniable. Many people felt that Pam Bondi had done what was right, even when it meant going up against a powerful figure in the judicial system. Activists who had long been calling for more transparency in government and legal processes now saw an ally in Bondi. Her courage to speak out, especially when the odds were stacked against her, resonated with a broader movement advocating for accountability at all levels of government. As public opinion shifted in Bondi's favor, Boasberg's defenders grew quieter. Even those who had once praised his judicial acumen now began to question his judgment, especially in light of the overwhelming evidence. His calm and calculated demeanor, which had once made him a pillar of integrity, now seemed more like a mask, one that was beginning to crack under the weight of public scrutiny. Even high-profile figures in legal circles, who had once dismissed the accusations as part of a partisan attack, were now openly calling for a thorough investigation. Courtrooms across the country, normally focused on their own proceedings, were now buzzing with discussions about Boasberg's alleged misconduct. At the same time, Bondi's reputation as a fearless defender of justice soared. Her actions had not only exposed a potential scandal, but had opened the door for further reform within the judicial system. As more voices rallied behind her, the pressure on Judge Boasberg reached a breaking point. The public outcry was no longer just about one judge. It had become a rallying cry for a more accountable judiciary where corruption and manipulation were no longer tolerated. The battle was only just beginning, but it was clear that Pam Bondi had changed the conversation. Justice, it seemed, would have to be served, not just in the courtroom, but also in the court of public opinion. The tide had turned, and Boasberg's actions were now under the magnifying glass like never before. As public support for Pam Bondi's accusations grew, the pressure on federal authorities to investigate Judge Boasberg mounted. Within days of her exposé, federal agencies, including the FBI and the Department of Justice, DOJ, launched an official investigation into the allegations of judicial misconduct. The intensity of the inquiry was evident. This was no longer just about one bad judge. It was about the integrity of the entire judicial system. Pam Bondi, whose role had been pivotal in exposing Boasberg, was now involved with investigators, providing them with the evidence and testimonies that she had gathered. The witnesses, including former judicial clerks and insiders who had worked with Boasberg, came forward to speak under oath. They confirmed the details of secretive meetings, unethical favors, and backroom deals that Bondi had accused Boasberg of participating in. As the investigation ramped up, the DOJ expanded its probe, questioning not just Boasberg's legal decisions, but his personal ties with powerful political figures and wealthy lobbyists. Evidence emerged that Boasberg had met with influential figures in the legal and political sphere without any official record of these meetings, raising questions about possible conflicts of interest. The FBI subpoenaed court documents, emails, and phone records from Boasberg's chambers, along with records of his financial transactions, looking for any links between the judge's alleged misconduct and the potential for bribery or illegal influence. Meanwhile, Boasberg's legal team scrambled to defend him, filing motions to block access to certain evidence and trying to prevent the investigation from gaining more traction. They claimed that the evidence was circumstantial, and the testimonies from whistleblowers were based on misunderstandings or personal grievances. Despite the efforts to protect him, the investigation continued to gather momentum. In private, many close to the case speculated that the evidence was stacking up against Boasberg, and that it was only a matter of time before the FBI or the DOJ would find enough to charge him with corruption and misuse of power. The legal community began to acknowledge that the clock was ticking for Boasberg, and the question wasn't if he would face charges, it was when. For Bondi, this was a defining moment. The stakes had been raised to an entirely new level. The federal investigation was now the center of public attention, and every new piece of evidence or witness testimony was creating even more uncertainty for Boasberg. His public confidence was eroding by the day, as the investigation threatened to unravel the reputation he had spent decades building. At the same time, support for Bondi reached new heights. She wasn't just a political figure anymore. She had become a symbol of justice, someone who had the courage to challenge the powerful when no one else would. The investigation, now in full swing, had already begun to expose cracks in the judicial system, and it was clear that the outcome would have profound consequences for Boasberg and anyone connected to him. As the federal investigation deepened, the evidence against Judge Boasberg became even more damning. Bondi's initial revelations had been powerful, but now with FBI agents and DOJ officials combing through Boasberg's records and connections, the full extent of his corruption began to unfold. The investigation uncovered that Boasberg had developed a network of secret allegiances with powerful individuals, including political figures, wealthy donors, and high-powered law firms. It was revealed that Boasberg had been involved in closed-door meetings with lobbyists and influential donors, where he discussed cases before they were even filed, and promised favorable rulings in exchange for financial support and personal favors. One particularly shocking discovery was a series of emails between Boasberg and a prominent law firm specializing in corporate cases. The emails showed that Boasberg had been providing the firm with inside information about upcoming cases, giving them an advantage in court. In exchange, the firm had donated large sums to Boasberg's personal charity, which, unbeknownst to the public, had been a vehicle for laundering illicit funds. There was also evidence that Boasberg had been receiving kickbacks from real estate developers who had cases pending in his court. Through hidden financial accounts and unreported gifts, Boasberg had cultivated relationships that would benefit him personally while directly impacting his judicial decisions. These financial arrangements were disguised as legal donations or consulting fees, but the paper trail left behind made it clear Boasberg was using his office for personal gain. The scandal grew even deeper when Boasberg's political affiliations were brought into the spotlight. Documents showed that he had been involved in private, undisclosed meetings with key political figures who had interests in cases that came before him. One such meeting, captured in a series of secretly recorded conversations, revealed that Boasberg had promised to rule in favor of a controversial corporate merger in exchange for future political support in his bid for higher office. Boasberg had been a member of several political action committees, PACs, receiving funds from them while still serving as a judge. This raised serious ethical concerns about his impartiality. The investigation also revealed connections to a high-profile political family, suggesting that Boasberg had been using his judicial position to sway decisions that would benefit the family's political agenda. As the full scope of Boasberg's misconduct came to light, public opinion became even more outraged. What had initially seemed like a case of isolated misjudgments now appeared to be a calculated scheme that spanned years, involving powerful political figures, wealthy donors, and a network of corrupt relationships. Pam Bondi's exposé, now backed by overwhelming evidence, had proven to be more than just a personal vendetta. She had uncovered a system of corruption within the judicial system that few had imagined could exist at such a high level. The pressure on Boasberg mounted as every new revelation made his position more untenable. The legal community, which had once stood in Boasberg's corner, was now divided. Some defended him, insisting that the charges were politically motivated, while others began to distance themselves, recognizing the damage done to the integrity of the judiciary. It was clear now that the case against Boasberg had escalated far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. His web of corruption wasn't just about manipulated cases. It was about decades of unethical practices that had now come to light, leaving Boasberg with no way to salvage his career or reputation. With criminal charges looking increasingly likely, the question was no longer whether Boasberg would face consequences, but how deep the corruption ran and who else might be implicated. As the federal investigation into Judge Boasberg unfolded, the evidence continued to mount, making it clear that his actions had gone far beyond unethical behavior. They were now criminal offenses. Federal prosecutors, now deeply involved in the case, began to move toward formal charges. The Department of Justice and the FBI, having sifted through the damning evidence, reached a conclusion that Boasberg's actions were not just violations of judicial ethics, but potentially criminal acts involving bribery, corruption, and abuse of power. The FBI uncovered a series of off-the-record communications between Boasberg and several lobbyists and corporate executives that seemed to suggest a pattern of quid pro quo arrangements. This went far beyond simple misconduct. It was clear that Boasberg had been willing to sell his influence in exchange for personal gain, including financial contributions and political leverage. With the evidence now clear, criminal charges were formally announced, focusing on bribery, racketeering, and misuse of judicial power. The public and media were stunned. What had initially been perceived as a judicial scandal was now a full-fledged criminal investigation that threatened to take down one of the most prominent judges in the nation's history. Bondi, who had been instrumental in uncovering the corruption, now watched as the justice system she had worked within for years came under fire. The very system she had once defended was being questioned. She knew that this was no longer just about Boasberg's downfall. It was about ensuring that this kind of behavior was never allowed to fester again. Boasberg's arrogant confidence began to fade as the criminal charges against him solidified. Legal experts were quick to point out that, if convicted, Boasberg could face years in prison, not just disbarment. The political fallout was also immense. His influence in legal and political circles was so extensive that many feared the ramifications of his downfall would reach far beyond just him. The legal community was in disarray. Longtime colleagues of Boasberg began to speak out, some admitting they had suspected something was wrong, while others rushed to distance themselves from the judge. Some of the high-profile lawyers and politicians who had supported Boasberg's career began to reconsider their alliances, fearing that their own reputations could be tainted by his actions. For Pam Bondi, the next few months would be filled with intense scrutiny. As public opinion continued to divide, some praising her bravery and others accusing her of political grandstanding, she remained focused on her ultimate goal, seeing real justice served. She had exposed a system of corruption, and now it was time to make sure it was held accountable, no matter how high the stakes. The question that lingered now wasn't just about Boasberg. It was about how many more judges, lawyers, and political figures were involved in similar corrupt practices, and whether the system could ever truly be trusted again. As the charges against Boasberg became official, the public's support for Bondi grew. While some critics still argued that the case was politically motivated, many viewed her as a courageous whistleblower who had exposed a deeply ingrained system of corruption. Justice reform activists rallied behind her, calling for further investigations into the practices of judges nationwide. The story was no longer just about a bad judge. It had become a broader conversation about the integrity of the legal system. Bondi had lit the fuse on a powder keg of public dissatisfaction with corruption in high places. The calls for accountability, transparency, and legal reform grew louder with each passing day. As Boasberg prepared for what would likely be a high-profile trial, the nation held its breath, awaiting the verdict not just on his fate but on the future of judicial integrity in America. The case against Judge Boasberg quickly became a flashpoint for intense public debate. As the investigation gained traction, social media exploded with reactions, and news outlets ran daily updates. The legal community and political commentators weighed in, drawing sharp lines of division. Support for Pam Bondi was overwhelmingly positive among those who believed that accountability was essential in the fight against corruption. Many saw her as a champion of transparency, someone willing to take on a powerful figure for the greater good of the judicial system. Lawyers, activists, and reform advocates rallied behind her, calling for greater oversight of judges and more whistleblower protection for those willing to expose corruption. Bondi was often referred to as a courageous advocate who had exposed a systemic issue. Legal reform organizations began drafting proposals to address the lack of accountability in the judicial system, and some even pushed for mandatory ethics training for all judges to ensure that incidents like Boasberg's would never happen again. However, not everyone agreed. Boasberg's supporters, many of whom had worked with him in the past, immediately attacked Bondi's accusations as politically motivated and unsubstantiated. Some argued that she was using the case to further her own career or to gain favor with certain political factions. Others pointed to Boasberg's long-standing reputation as a fair and thoughtful judge, dismissing the evidence as out of context or misinterpreted. Within the legal profession itself, the reaction was equally divided. Some of Boasberg's colleagues stood by him, insisting that he was an honest man who had been caught in a political trap. They pointed to his record of fair decisions over the years, emphasizing his commitment to the law. However, others in the field began to question how well they truly knew him, citing the growing body of evidence that seemed to suggest a long history of misconduct. Some judges and legal scholars began to speak out in favor of greater judicial oversight. Law schools and legal think tanks debated the implications of the case, suggesting that the Boasberg scandal could become a catalyst for change in how the judiciary was policed. There was talk of new measures to protect whistleblowers in the legal community and tighter scrutiny of judges who might otherwise slip through the cracks. In the wake of the criminal charges, public opinion on Boasberg was split right down the middle. Polls showed a stark division. Half the country believed he was a victim of a coordinated political attack, while the other half saw his fall from grace as long overdue. The deepening divide meant that the case was now as much about partisan loyalty as it was about legal accountability. Some political pundits weighed in, calling for reform across the board in the judicial system. They pointed out that Boasberg was only the tip of the iceberg and that if the system was to regain the public's trust, it would require broad changes, from greater transparency in judicial appointments to more stringent ethics rules for all judges. As the case continued to unfold, Pam Bondi found herself in the middle of this polarizing debate, but she also realized that the spotlight was solidifying her place in the larger conversation about judicial reform. She wasn't just someone exposing one judge. She was becoming a symbol of accountability and transparency in a system many felt had gone unchecked for too long. Bondi continued to stand firm in her position, speaking out for what she believed was right despite the criticism. At every public appearance, she maintained her composure and focus, emphasizing that this fight wasn't about her personal gain or political power. It was about preserving the integrity of the judicial system for future generations. As Boasberg's trial approached, Bondi knew that the outcome would not only determine the judge's fate, but would also be a test case for the future of the judiciary in America. Will the public's trust in the system be restored, or would the Boasberg scandal mark a turning point in how judges were held accountable? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain. Pam Bondi had made her mark, and the future of the judicial system was now in the hands of the courts. As the legal proceedings unfolded and the criminal charges against Judge Boasberg became more substantial, the conversation shifted to what consequences he would face. It was no longer just about the scandalous revelations. Now the legal and political machinery was in motion to decide whether Boasberg would be suspended, impeached, or face a full-blown criminal trial. Boasberg's defense team mounted a vigorous effort to delay the proceedings, claiming that the case had become politicized and that he had been wrongfully accused. They argued that the charges were based on misinterpretations of the evidence, and that he should be allowed to continue in his role as a judge until the court had definitively ruled on his case. Despite these efforts, the public outcry grew louder. Politicians, legal analysts, and even some of Boasberg's former colleagues were now questioning his fitness to remain in office. The legal community was divided, but more and more voices began calling for swift action. Boasberg's fall from grace had opened the door for wider conversations about judicial accountability and ethics within the courts. His lack of transparency and secret dealings were becoming unacceptable in an age when people demanded justice without corruption. The U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee began holding hearings to address the crisis of confidence caused by Boasberg's actions. Political figures from both sides of the aisle expressed deep concern about the damage to the public trust in the judicial system. Some senators, including those who had worked closely with Boasberg in the past, called for his impeachment, believing that the evidence against him was so compelling that he could not be allowed to continue serving as a judge. Meanwhile, others suggested that Boasberg be temporarily suspended while a full investigation into his criminal behavior was conducted. This option seemed to offer a more immediate resolution, allowing for the safeguarding of the judiciary's credibility while still providing Boasberg an opportunity to clear his name through the legal process. Inside Boasberg's office, the weight of the investigation was taking a toll. The judge, once a man of unshakable confidence, now seemed to show signs of cracking under the pressure. Those close to him noted that he had become more reclusive, spending long hours alone and visibly agitated. His attempts to maintain a composed and calm exterior were no longer as convincing, and his defensive posture only seemed to make his situation worse. The public hearings were scheduled to take place, where Boasberg would be forced to explain his actions. Many feared that the public spectacle of his defense would do irreparable damage to his reputation, even if he was eventually cleared of criminal charges. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi remained steadfast in her efforts to ensure that Boasberg would face consequences. She used her platform to demand transparency and justice, calling for the impeachment process to move swiftly. She also echoed the sentiment of many who believe that judicial accountability should be enforced through tougher oversight mechanisms that could prevent such corruption from occurring again. Bondi's message was simple: no one should be above the law, not even the judges who are supposed to protect it. As she continued to speak out in the media, her reputation as a fighter for justice continued to grow. Her actions had sparked a nationwide conversation about how to fix a broken system, and she was now seen as one of the leading figures in the movement for judicial reform.